The truth behind this 1880 family photo is darker than anyone imagined. The package arrived at the Boston Historical Society on a gray October morning in 2024, wrapped in brown paper and tied with ordinary string. Inside, curator Dr. Sarah Mitchell found a single photograph mounted in a cracked leather frame. No letter, no explanation. Just an old family portrait from 1880, its sepia tones faded but still remarkably clear. Sarah held it up to the light streaming through her office window. A family of 8 stared back at her. A stern-looking man in his 40s stood at the center, one hand resting on an ornate chair. Beside him sat a woman in her 30s, her dark dress buttoned to the throat, her face expressionless. 6 children ranged in age from perhaps 4 to 16, arranged in descending height. Another Victorian family photo, Sarah muttered, setting it on her desk. She'd cataloged hundreds like it over her 15-year career. Respectable families preserving their image for posterity, frozen in time before some photographer's unwieldy camera. But something made her pause. She reached for her magnifying glass, a habit formed from years of examining historical documents. The children's faces came into sharper focus. Their eyes. There was something in their eyes. Not the usual stiffness required by long exposure times, but something else. Fear, exhaustion. Sarah leaned closer. The youngest child, a girl of about 4, had her hands clasped in front of her, but the position seemed unnatural, forced. The boy beside her, perhaps 7, had a bruise barely visible on his cheekbone. She'd almost missed it. Her phone buzzed, her assistant, Marcus, reminding her about the board meeting in 20 minutes. Sarah glanced at the photo once more, then carefully placed it in a preservation sleeve. "I'll get back to you," she whispered to the silent faces. She had no idea that this photograph would consume the next 3 months of her life, unraveling a story so disturbing that it would make national news and force historians to reconsider everything they thought they knew about respectable Victorian families in Boston. That evening, Sarah sat in her apartment in Cambridge, unable to shake the image from her mind. She poured herself a glass of wine and pulled up her laptop, searching the museum's database for any similar anonymous donations. Nothing matched. Whoever had sent this photograph had done so with purpose, but why now? Why after 144 years? The rain began to fall outside her window, and Sarah found herself thinking about those children, wondering what their lives had been like, what stories they could tell if given the chance. Sarah couldn't stop thinking about the photograph. During the board meeting, while her colleagues discussed funding for the new Civil War exhibit, her mind kept returning to those children's faces. The bruise, the unnatural postures, the woman's blank stare. That evening, after everyone had left, she returned to her office and pulled out the photo. She had access to the museum's high-resolution scanner, a device capable of capturing details invisible to the naked eye. She positioned the photograph carefully under the light and started the scanning process. 20 minutes later, the digital image appeared on her computer screen. Sarah zoomed in on the woman first. Her hands, folded demurely in her lap, showed something Sarah hadn't noticed before. Circular marks around both wrists, partially hidden by her long sleeves. Not shadows, not artifacts from the developing process. Marks. Sarah's stomach tightened. She'd seen similar marks in historical documents about enslaved people and prisoners. Restraint marks. She moved to the children. The eldest girl, perhaps 16, stood slightly apart from the others, her shoulder angled as if trying to shield the younger ones. Her expression was carefully controlled, but her jaw was clenched tight. The second boy had what looked like a healing cut above his eyebrow. Then Sarah noticed the background. Behind the family, partially obscured by the photographer's backdrop curtain, stood another figure. A man, younger than the patriarch, barely visible in the shadows. His presence made no sense. Victorian photography required subjects to remain perfectly still. Why would someone stand in the background, hidden during a formal family portrait? Sarah enlarged the image further. The hidden man's face was turned slightly toward the family, and his expression was unmistakable even across 144 years, contempt mixed with satisfaction. She sat back in her chair, her heart racing. This wasn't just another Victorian family photo. This was evidence. But evidence of what? Sarah made detailed notes, marking every anomaly she could find. The way the father's hand gripped the chair, knuckles white, suggesting tension or anger. The middle son's posture, spine rigid as if at attention. The second daughter's eyes, red-rimmed as though she'd been crying before the photo was taken. She printed out the enhanced image and pinned it to her office wall. Tomorrow, she would begin the real investigation. Tonight, she needed to understand what she was looking at. This family had secrets, and somehow someone wanted those secrets found after more than a century of silence. Sarah stayed at the museum until nearly midnight, unable to tear herself away from those haunted faces staring back at her. Sarah arrived at the museum early the next morning, coffee in hand and determination in her step. She needed to identify this family. Without provenance, no donor name, no accompanying documents, she'd have to work backward from the photograph itself. She started with the photographer's mark. In the bottom right corner, embossed in fading gold ink, Whitmore & Sons, Studio Photography, Boston, Mass. She pulled up the museum's database of 19th century Boston businesses. Whitmore & Sons had operated from 1875 to 1891 on Tremont Street near the Common. "Got you," Sarah whispered. Next, she examined the family's clothing and the studio props. The man wore a well-tailored suit, expensive for the era. The chair he stood beside was mahogany with carved details, a photographer's prop meant to suggest wealth and status. The woman's dress, though severe, was made of quality fabric. This was an affluent family, or at least one trying to appear affluent. Sarah called the Boston City Archives. After 20 minutes on hold, a clerk named Thomas answered. "I need to access property records and census data from 1880, Sarah explained. "Specifically, wealthy families in the Back Bay and Beacon Hill areas." "That's a lot of families," Thomas said doubtfully. "I'm looking for a family with 6 children, ages approximately 4 to 16. The father would have been in his 40s. Thomas sighed. "Come by this afternoon. I'll pull what I can." The archive building smelled of old paper and dust. Thomas had laid out census records and city directories across a reading table. Sarah settled in, her eyes scanning columns of names, ages, occupations. Hours passed. The gas lamps outside flickered on as dusk fell. Sarah's vision blurred from reading cramped handwriting, but she pressed on. Then, on page 47 of the 1880 census, she found them. The household of Jonathan Pierce, age 43, manufacturer. Wife Catherine, age 32. Children, Elizabeth 16, Thomas 14, Robert 11, Margaret 9, William 7, and Alice 4. The ages matched perfectly. Sarah's hands trembled as she copied down the address, 287 Commonwealth Avenue. She also noted the occupation, manufacturer. That meant business records, employee rosters, possibly newspaper mentions. "Found something?" Thomas asked, looking over her shoulder. "I found them," Sarah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Now I need to find out who they really were." She gathered her notes and headed back to the museum, her mind already racing ahead to the next steps. Property records, business registries, newspaper archives. She had a name now, and names opened doors. But as she walked through the darkening streets of Boston, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to uncover something far worse than she'd imagined. The brownstone still stood, remarkably intact after 144 years. Sarah stood across the street from 287 Commonwealth Avenue, her breath forming small clouds in the November air. The building had been converted into luxury condominiums, but its Victorian facade remained unchanged. Tall windows, ornate iron railings, and stone steps leading to a heavy wooden door. She'd spent the previous week researching Jonathan Pierce. Born in 1837 to a textile merchant family, he'd expanded the business after his father's death, opening 3 factories by 1875. The newspapers called him a captain of industry and a pillar of the community. He served on charitable boards, donated to churches, and hosted elaborate parties that made the society pages. The perfect Victorian gentleman. But Sarah had also found other records. Employee rosters from his factories showed an unusually high turnover rate. A brief newspaper mention from 1882 reported labor unrest at one of his mills, quickly resolved. 3 separate workers had died in factory accidents between 1878 and 1884, a rate higher than similar operations. She crossed the street and rang the buzzer for the building manager. A woman in her 60s answered, introducing herself as Gloria. "I'm researching the building's history," Sarah explained, showing her museum credentials. Specifically, the Pierce family who lived here in 1880. Gloria's expression changed. "Oh, the Pierces. You know about them?" "Come in," Gloria said quietly. The lobby had been modernized, but Gloria led Sarah to the basement, where original architectural elements remained. She pulled out a file box labeled Building History. "The current owners are required to maintain historical records," Gloria explained. "When I took this job 5 years ago, I read through everything. The Pierce family, there were rumors." She handed Sarah a yellowed newspaper clipping from 1885. The headline read, "Prominent manufacturer faces questions about household management." Sarah scanned the article. It was carefully worded, the kind of Victorian journalism that implied without stating directly. Concerns raised by former domestic staff and questions about the treatment of certain individuals. "There's more," Gloria said, pulling out a letter. The envelope was sealed in plastic, preserved carefully. Gloria handled it with reverence. "This was found during a renovation in 2019, hidden inside a wall cavity. Someone wanted it found, but not until long after they were gone." Sarah's pulse quickened as Gloria carefully removed the letter from its protective sleeve. The handwriting was neat, practiced, but the ink had faded to a rusty brown. She began to read, and with each line, the photograph's terrible secrets began to reveal themselves. The letter was dated March 1881 and written in careful, practiced handwriting. Sarah's hands shook slightly as she read. "To whom it may concern, I served in the household of Mr. Jonathan Pierce from September 1879 until February 1881. I write this account because I can no longer remain silent about what I witnessed in that house on Commonwealth Avenue. I pray that someday someone will read these words and understand the truth about a family that appears respectable but lives in terror." The author identified herself as Mary O'Brien, an Irish immigrant who worked as a housemaid. She described a household ruled by fear. Jonathan Pierce, she wrote, maintained absolute control through intimidation and violence. The children were forbidden from speaking at meals unless directly addressed. They studied from dawn until dusk, with any mistake in their lessons resulting in punishment, sometimes a slap, sometimes being locked in the cellar for hours. But it was what Mary wrote about Catherine Pierce that made Sarah's breath catch. "Mrs. Pierce is a prisoner in her own home. Mr. Pierce locks her in her room at night. I have heard the key turn in the lock many times. I have seen the marks on her wrists from the restraints he uses when she becomes, as he calls it, hysterical. She tried to leave once, in the winter of 1880, taking the youngest children with her. She made it as far as her sister's home in Providence. Mr. Mum Pierce brought them back within 2 days. I heard her screaming that night. The next morning she was silent and would not meet anyone's eyes. She has not tried to leave since." Mary described the man Sarah had noticed in the photograph, Pierce's younger brother, Edward, who lived in the house and helped maintain order. Edward, Mary wrote, was even crueler than Jonathan, taking pleasure in frightening the children and punishing the servants for minor infractions. She wrote about workers from Pierce's factories who sometimes came to the house late at night, brought there to live in the servants' quarters in the attic. These workers, Mary observed, were primarily young Irish immigrants who spoke little English. They worked impossibly long hours, both in the factory and in the household, and seemed terrified of Mr. Pierce. One young man, Sean, tried to leave after 3 months. Mr. Pierce told him he owed money for his passage from Ireland and for room and board. The debt was impossible, more than a year's wages. Sean disappeared one night. Mr. Pierce said he had run away, but I saw fear in the other workers' eyes. They knew something I did not. The letter ended abruptly. I left because I feared for my own safety. I wanted to help Mrs. Pierce and those children, but I have no power, no money, and no voice that anyone would believe over Mr. Pierce's. I am told that speaking publicly about him would result in legal action I cannot afford. But I must tell someone. Those children deserve better. Mrs. Pierce deserves better. I pray someone reads this and investigates. I pray I am wrong about my darkest suspicions, but I fear I am not. Mary O'Brien, March 15th, 1881. Sarah looked up at Gloria, tears in her eyes. Has anyone else seen this? The renovation contractor, me, and now you. Sarah spent the next 2 weeks at the Massachusetts State Archives, buried in industrial records from Pierce's textile factories. What she found painted a disturbing picture of systematic exploitation that extended far beyond his household. The primary facility, Pierce Manufacturing on Summer Street, employed over 200 workers in 1880. The majority were Irish immigrants, many recently arrived and desperate for work. The employment ledgers showed something unusual. Numerous workers shared the same residential address, 287 Commonwealth Avenue. Jonathan Pierce had been housing workers in his own home. Sarah cross-referenced the names with immigration records and ship manifests. At least 15 factory workers lived in the Pierce household between 1878 and 1884, most staying only a few months before disappearing from all records entirely. No forwarding addresses. No subsequent employment records in Boston or surrounding cities. They simply vanished from history. She found payroll ledgers that showed these live-in workers received significantly reduced wages, with deductions for room and board that consumed nearly their entire salary. One worker, a young man named Sean Murphy, the same Sean mentioned in Mary O'Brien's letter, had his wages completely withheld for 3 months with a notation: damages to property, debt repayment. The accident reports were worse. In 1879, a worker named Patrick Donnelly lost 3 fingers in a loom mechanism. The report blamed worker carelessness and intoxication and noted no compensation was provided. Another worker, Bridget Kelly, suffered severe burns from a chemical spill in 1881. The report stated she abandoned her position without notice immediately following a minor workplace incident. Code, Sarah realized, for being dismissed while injured to avoid any responsibility. But it was a police report from June 1880 that made everything click into place. 2 workers from Pierce Manufacturing, brothers named Colin and Daniel McCarthy, had attempted to file a complaint about working conditions with the Boston Police Department. The report documented their allegations: 16-hour workdays with no breaks, physical punishment for slow production, wages withheld as fines for minor infractions like talking during work, and dangerous equipment maintained poorly to save costs. The case was dismissed within a week. The officer's notes indicated that Jonathan Pierce had provided substantial evidence of the workers' unreliability, previous criminal behavior, and tendencies toward fabrication. Both brothers left Boston shortly after. Sarah found their names on a ship manifest to New York, dated 3 weeks after the complaint was filed. She sat back in the archives reading room, her mind racing. Pierce hadn't just abused his family. He'd created an entire system of exploitation that trapped desperate immigrants in a cycle of debt and fear, using his social standing and wealth to silence anyone who dared speak against him. The photograph took on new meaning. It wasn't just a family portrait. It was a monument to control, a carefully constructed facade hiding systematic cruelty. Sarah gathered her research and headed back to the museum. She needed to find descendants, people who might have family stories or documents that could corroborate what she was discovering. The truth was emerging, piece by terrible piece. Finding living descendants proved easier than Sarah expected. A genealogy website connected her with Patricia Thornton, Jonathan Pierce's great-great-granddaughter, who lived in Portland, Maine. When Sarah called to explain her research, Patricia's response was immediate. "I've been waiting for someone to ask about him," she said. "My whole life my family has maintained this fiction that he was a great man. But I knew. Somehow I always knew something was terribly wrong." They met at a cafe in Boston's North End on a cold December morning. Patricia, a retired teacher in her early 70s, arrived carrying a worn leather satchel that she placed carefully on the table between them. "I brought everything I have," she said. "Letters, Photographs, documents my grandmother saved. She made me promise to keep them, to never throw them away. She said someday someone would need to see them. Patricia pulled out a family Bible from her satchel. Inside the front cover, written in fading ink, were birth and death dates for multiple generations. But several entries had been scratched out violently, rendered completely illegible. My grandmother did this, Patricia explained. Before she died in 1975, she told me, "Some names don't deserve to be remembered. Some men don't deserve to have their legacy honored." I was 12. I didn't understand then. She wouldn't explain further, just said I'd know when the time came. Patricia had her own collection of documents, letters, diary entries, and photographs that had been passed down through Elizabeth Pierce's line. Elizabeth was the eldest daughter in the 1880 photograph. One letter, written by Elizabeth in 1895, 15 years after that photograph was taken, described her childhood in devastating detail. We were taught that father's authority was absolute and unquestionable. To disagree was to invite punishment. To cry was weakness. To show fear was failure. Mother tried to protect us, but she had no power. He controlled everything: our education, our social interactions, our clothing, our food, even our thoughts. We were not children. We were property, possessions to be molded into whatever he deemed acceptable. I watched my mother fade year by year, watched the light die in her eyes. I watched my younger siblings learn to become invisible, to speak only when spoken to exist as quietly as possible. The photograph he forced us to sit for in 1880, I remember that day. He threatened us beforehand. Any child who did not sit perfectly still, who cried or complained, would be locked in the cellar for 2 days. We were terrified. You can see it in our faces if you know what to look for. Elizabeth had escaped at 18 by marrying quickly, choosing a kind but poor clerk over her father's preferred suitor, a wealthy business associate. Her father had disowned her, cut her from his will, and forbidden the rest of the family from contacting her. She never returned to Commonwealth Avenue. She never saw her mother again. Patricia showed Sarah another document, a death certificate for Catherine Pierce, dated November 1884. Cause of death: nervous exhaustion and complications thereof. She was 36 years old. Patricia said quietly, her voice trembling. 4 years after that photograph. She died in that house, probably still locked in her room at night, still trapped. Elizabeth tried to attend the funeral. Father had her physically removed from the church. Sarah's investigation took a darker turn when she discovered court records from 1883. A lawsuit had been filed against Jonathan Pierce by a former factory supervisor named Henry Walsh, alleging wrongful termination after Walsh had reported safety violations to city inspectors. The depositions were revealing in ways Walsh probably hadn't intended. He testified that Pierce regularly brought workers to his home, ostensibly to provide them housing during their first months in America, but actually to control them more completely. Workers who lived in the Commonwealth Avenue house were forbidden from leaving without written permission. They worked both in the factory during the day and as household servants in the evening, essentially trapped in a cycle of debt and intimidation. Walsh described visiting the house once in early 1883 for a meeting with Pierce about production quotas. He'd arrived early and witnessed things he wasn't meant to see. Children, Pierce's own children, scrubbing floors alongside the workers. One of the sons, Walsh couldn't recall which, polishing silver in the dining room while Pierce stood over him, criticizing every movement. Walsh had witnessed Pierce strike one of his sons across the face for speaking out of turn, for daring to ask a question. When Walsh had expressed concern, suggesting that children should be in school rather than doing household labor, Pierce had him removed from the property by Edward, the younger brother. Walsh was fired the next day, and when he protested, Pierce had him blacklisted from other manufacturing positions in Boston. The lawsuit was settled out of court for a small sum, with Walsh signing a non-disclosure agreement. But the depositions remained public record, preserved in the Massachusetts court archives. Sarah found more. Hospital records from Massachusetts General showed that Catherine Pierce had been admitted 3 times between 1880 and 1883 for nervous disorders, melancholia, and female hysteria. Victorian diagnoses that could mean anything from depression to attempting suicide. Each time, according to the admission notes, she'd been brought in by family members or neighbors, not by her husband. Each time, her husband had signed her discharge papers after only a few days, removing her against medical advice. A doctor's note from October 1882 was particularly damning. Patient expresses extreme fear of returning home. Shows signs of sustained physical and psychological trauma, including bruising on upper arms consistent with restraint, marks on wrists, and significant weight loss. Patient states she is locked in her room nightly and forbidden from seeing her children unsupervised. Recommend extended rest in a sanitarium and immediate separation from source of distress. Husband arrived during examination, insists on immediate discharge, threatens legal action against hospital if patient is not released to his custody. I am deeply concerned for her welfare but have no legal authority to prevent him from taking her. I fear for what will happen when she returns to that house. 3 weeks later, Catherine Pierce was admitted again, this time unconscious. The notes indicated possible laudanum overdose, though whether accidental or intentional was unclear. She was discharged after 2 days, again at her husband's insistence. The hidden man in the photograph, Edward Pierce, had his own dark history. Sarah found court records showing he'd been arrested twice for assault in Providence and New York before coming to live with his brother in 1878. The charges had been dropped both times after significant financial settlements to the victims and their families. Sarah sat in the archive as closing time approached, staring at the documents spread before her. The Commonwealth Avenue house hadn't been a home. It had been a prison, a factory, and a monument to one man's cruelty, all hidden behind a facade of Victorian respectability and wealth. Sarah decided to go public. She contacted the Boston Globe, and a journalist named Rachel Kim jumped on the story. Rachel was known for her investigative work on historical injustices, and she understood immediately the significance of what Sarah had uncovered. Together they compiled everything: the photograph with its visible signs of abuse, Mary O'Brien's hidden letter, the factory records showing systematic exploitation, the court depositions, the hospital records documenting Catherine's suffering, and Patricia's family documents revealing the long-term trauma that had echoed through generations. Rachel interviewed Patricia extensively, recording her family's oral history, stories passed down about the dark years when the family lived under Jonathan Pierce's control. She interviewed historians specializing in Victorian-era domestic violence and labor practices, providing context for Pierce's behavior. The article ran on a Sunday in late November 2024, front page, with the 1880 photograph prominently displayed. The headline read, "Behind the Portrait: How One Victorian Family's Dark Secrets Remained Hidden for 144 Years." The response was immediate and overwhelming. The museum's phone rang constantly. Historians called to share similar cases they'd encountered. Journalists requested interviews. Descendants of other Pierce factory workers came forward with additional information, stories their grandparents had told about the terrible Mr. Pierce and his factories. A genealogist in County Cork, Ireland, contacted Sarah with records showing that at least 8 of Pierce's Irish workers had disappeared from all records after working for him. Their families back in Ireland had spent years searching for them, writing letters to Boston addresses that went unanswered, never learning what happened to their sons and daughters who'd crossed the ocean seeking a better life. One woman, Fiona Murphy, now in her 80s and living in Dublin, had been searching for information about her great-uncle Sean Murphy for decades. When Sarah sent her the payroll record showing Sean's wages withheld and then his name disappearing from all documentation, Fiona wept. "My great-grandmother died never knowing what happened to her son," Fiona said over a video call. She blamed herself for letting him go to America. "The family always wondered. Now we know he didn't abandon us. Something terrible happened to him." A structural engineer examining another building Pierce had owned, a former warehouse converted to apartments, found a sealed room in the basement during a renovation inspection. Inside were shackles bolted to the wall and evidence of human habitation: old straw bedding, chamber pots, scratches on the walls marking days. The building had briefly served as worker housing in 1882. The Massachusetts Historical Commission launched an official investigation into Pierce's properties and business practices. Patricia Thornton appeared on national news, speaking calmly but emotionally about her family's history of abuse and her relief that the truth was finally being acknowledged publicly. For generations we were told to be proud of our ancestor, this great man who built a manufacturing empire, Patricia said on camera. But some of us knew. We knew there was something wrong with that story. I'm grateful to Sarah for having the courage to dig deeper, to see what was really in that photograph. But the most significant discovery came from an unexpected source. A construction crew renovating the basement of 287 Commonwealth Avenue, spurred by the news coverage to look more carefully at the building's structure, found something during what should have been a routine inspection: human remains buried beneath the foundation in what had once been a coal cellar. The medical examiner determined the remains belonged to a young man, aged approximately 20 to 25, who had died sometime between 1878 and 1885. Evidence suggested blunt force trauma to the skull, a fatal blow to the back of the head. Dental records and bone analysis indicated Irish ancestry, consistent with the immigrant workers Pierce had employed. The police opened a cold case investigation, unlikely to ever result in charges given that all involved parties had been dead for over a century, but determined to identify the victim. Using DNA analysis and comparing records of missing workers, they eventually identified the remains as belonging to Sean Murphy, the young man mentioned in Mary O'Brien's letter and whose name had disappeared from Pierce's payroll records in 1880. Sean's family in Ireland was contacted. Fiona Murphy, his great-niece, arranged for his remains to be returned to County Cork for proper burial in the family plot, finally bringing him home 144 years after he'd left. "He's not forgotten anymore," Fiona said at the small funeral in Ireland which Sarah attended. "He's not just a name that disappeared. He was a real person, and what happened to him mattered. Thank you for giving him back his story." The photograph that had arrived anonymously at the Boston Historical Society now hung in a permanent exhibit at the museum titled "Hidden Truths: Domestic Violence and Labor Exploitation in Victorian Boston." Sarah had curated it herself, ensuring that every aspect of the Pierce family's story was told with sensitivity, accuracy, and respect for the victims. Catherine Pierce's name appeared first, in large letters above her image from the photograph. Below it, text explained, "Catherine Pierce, 1848-1884, victim of domestic abuse, false imprisonment, and systematic psychological torture. Died at age 36, likely from complications of sustained trauma. Her suffering was hidden behind social respectability for over a century. She deserved better. Her story matters." Each of the 6 children had their own panel with their photographs and life stories. Elizabeth, who had escaped and lived to age 72, was quoted from her letters. "I survived because I never forgot what freedom meant, and I was determined my own children would never know the fear that defined my childhood." Thomas and Robert had both left Boston as young men, moving west and building lives far from their father's shadow. Both had refused to ever speak about their childhood, taking most of their trauma to their graves. Margaret had died young, at 23, from what records listed as consumption, but Patricia believed was suicide based on family stories. She had never married, never left Boston, and according to one relative's diary, never smiled after mother died. William had become a social reformer, working to improve factory conditions and worker protections. He testified before the Massachusetts legislature in favor of child labor laws and workplace safety regulations. He never mentioned his father by name, but his life's work was clearly a response to what he'd witnessed. Alice, the youngest in the photograph, the 4-year-old with the unnaturally clasped hands, had eventually written a memoir in the 1930s, never published, that Sarah had discovered in a university archive. It detailed the abuse in devastating clarity, describing a childhood lived in constant fear, always waiting for the next punishment, the next explosion of rage. The exhibit also honored the workers whose names Sarah had uncovered. A wall listed every name she'd found in Pierce's factory records and employment ledgers, particularly those who had disappeared. Forgotten victims of industrial exploitation and possible violence. May their names be remembered. May their suffering be acknowledged. May we learn from this history to build a more just world. Sean Murphy's photograph, provided by his family in Ireland, was displayed in a place of honor beside a panel explaining his story and how his remains had been found and identified. The Commonwealth Avenue building now bore a historical marker, installed by the city after significant public pressure. It read, 287 Commonwealth Avenue, site of domestic abuse and labor exploitation, 1878-1890. Jonathan Pierce used this residence to imprison his wife, control his children through fear and violence, and trap immigrant workers in conditions of debt servitude. Several workers who lived here disappeared and are presumed dead. This marker honors the victims and reminds us that respectability and wealth can hide terrible cruelty. Installed 2024. Patricia attended the exhibit's opening in January 2025, standing for a long time before the photograph of her great-great-grandfather's family. Her own daughter and granddaughter stood beside her. "They're not frozen anymore," Patricia said to Sarah, tears streaming down her face. "They're finally free to tell their truth, and maybe now, finally, they can rest." Sarah returned to her office after the opening, exhausted but satisfied. The exhibit had been emotionally draining to create, but necessary. These stories needed to be told. These victims needed to be remembered. On her desk sat another package, just arrived that morning. Brown paper, simple string, no return address. Inside was another photograph, this one from 1892, showing a different family and a different city. But Sarah recognized the signs immediately. The tense postures, the fearful eyes, the hidden details that spoke of secrets and suffering. She smiled sadly and reached for her magnifying glass. Some truths take 144 years to emerge, but they're always worth finding. Every victim deserves to have their story told, their suffering acknowledged, their humanity restored. The work continues. The truth always finds a way out, eventually. And Sarah would be there to help it emerge, one photograph at a time, giving voice to those who had been silenced for far too long. She began her research, knowing that somewhere, descendants were waiting for answers, for validation, for the truth that would finally set their ancestors' stories free.